nation, your province, your Southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News Weekend Edition with Jeanette Roche.
Hello, thanks for joining us for our week in review. It was a big week for Alberta's new Premier. Danielle Smith was officially sworn in as the province's 19th Premier and third female leader on Tuesday afternoon. The special ceremony, conducted by Lieutenant Governor Salma Lakhani, took place at Government House in Edmonton.
Alberta is truly one of the best places in the world to live and work and raise a family. Over the last 117 years, we've written an incredible story together in partnership with Alberta's First Nations and Métis, who by treaty invited us to join them. You can come here from any walk of life in any corner of the world, and if you're willing to put in hard work, then you're going to thrive. There's just so much opportunity. There's just so much opportunity. Like many Albertans, I've always believed that freedom is foundational. Albertans have been through so much over these last 2.5 years. Our rights and freedoms have been tested. I will ensure, as head of this government, that those rights and freedoms are protected and will never be taken for granted again.
Premier Smith offered up some details on healthcare reform, including the fact that Alberta's Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Dina Hinshaw, will be replaced. Smith was also criticized this week when she said unvaccinated people were discriminated against more than any other group in her lifetime. Here she is talking about the impact of it on the healthcare system.
A lot of that problem was created by policies at Alberta Health Services of having mandatory vaccinations. So it prevented us from being able to hire back everyone who had been let go up until about 2.5 months ago when Cabinet directed them to end the mandate. It prevented us from being able to graduate students across the full range of professions because they also had vaccine mandates. It prevented us from being able to hire from other jurisdictions. Through the full range of people who would have otherwise wanted to come here because of vaccine mandates. So they actually, at the management level, made things even worse for our front line.
Since her comment on the unvaxxed being discriminated against, Premier Smith released a statement on Twitter Wednesday afternoon clarifying her comments. In a tweet, she said, quote, "Yesterday I made comments regarding the discrimination unvaccinated individuals have suffered through during the past 2 years. My intention was to underline the mistreatment of individuals who chose not to be vaccinated and were punished by not being able to work, travel, or in some cases, see loved ones. I want to be clear that I did not intend to trivialize in any way the discrimination faced by minority communities and other persecuted groups, both here in Canada and around the world," end quote. Elections Alberta has called a by-election for November 8th in Brooks, Medicine Hat. That is the constituency where Premier Smith says that she intends to seek a seat. Smith, who succeeded Jason Kenney as leader of the UCP, does not yet have a seat but will need to win one in order to sit at the legislature. The Brooks Medicine Hat seat became vacant when the current representative, Michaela Frey, resigned last week Friday. The next general election is slated for May 29th. Smith has said she will not call an earlier vote. Meanwhile, the Alberta NDP say they're gearing up for a big by-election battle in that same Brooks Medicine Hat riding where Smith will be seeking a seat. The NDP will be moving forward with their candidate, Gwendolyn Dirk. Dirk was acclaimed the opposition party's candidate back in June. She realizes it will be an undertaking going up against Premier Smith in a traditionally strong Conservative riding, but she says she's up for the challenge.
I'm quite excited about it. I've been out talking to people since I was nominated. Actually, even before I was nominated, I've been out in the doors, speaking with the residents of Brooks Medicine Hat and finding out how they're feeling. And I gathered a strong team of supporters who are walking with me and have been out at the doors with me. And we're ready, we're excited, and bring it on. Probably the number one issue that I'm hearing is about the chaos in healthcare that was directly caused by the fight with the doctors. People in Medicine Hat cannot find a family doctor. No new doctors in Medicine Hat are taking on new patients, and that's a direct result of the chaos of the UCP and doctors leaving the province and the city.
The by-election in Brooks Medicine Hat will take place on November the 8th. We need to take a short break, but when we return, a unique look at the new political landscape of Alberta and what's on the horizon for Jason Kenney, private business or social media. There's a lot more after this time out. Stay with us.
He's already poking at his successor, so still hasn't resigned as an MLA, but I honestly can't see him going back into the ledge.
Welcome back. A week into Alberta's UCP having a new leader, there have already been a few developments, to say the least. The NDP are looking for any advantage. Jason Kenney has taken to Twitter, and Danielle Smith has started leading her party and our province. Earlier this week, I was joined by the Western Standard's Dave Naylor. We took a deep dive into this era of worldly frustrations and Alberta's politics. Take a look. Dave, have we heard anything of substance from Rachel Notley and the NDP since Smith took over the leadership?
Well, you know what, the Rachel Notley NDP election machine has been sort of in full power for a couple of weeks now. They're putting out 2 or 3 press releases a day. They have any announcement the UCP makes, within half an hour, there's a press release from the NDP saying how wrong the UCP is. Rachel Notley held a press conference an hour or so ago, again slamming Smith for her COVID vaccine comments, saying it's unfit and she's not worthy as a leader. So, the election's not too far off in May. I think it's fair to say the gloves have come off already. No honeymoon period for Premier Smith, and it's going to be a good, long, drag-em-out fight from now until the end of May. And Jeanette, I for one can't wait. I mean, those two would tear into each other.
Oh, absolutely. I think it will be very exciting as well, because they're both such strong personalities, if you would, right? Okay, so one thing that we have been discussing this week that we're seeing is Smith's need for a seat in the legislature, which now MLA for Brooks Medicine Hat, Michaela Frey, is volunteering. So this is a solid conservative seat, but it sounds like the NDP are considering bringing in a ringer to win the seat. So what are your thoughts on this, Dave?
Well, she needed to get into the legislature quickly, and obviously she found a willing participant to stand aside. She did take a lot of flack, though, because she called the by-election in the Brooks Medicine Hat one, but did not call it in the open seat of Calgary Elbow. Some people said she should have run in Calgary Elbow, but she wants to represent a rural area. She says to show the importance of the rural voter and what the rural person thinks. And it is going to be a battle of rural versus urban in the election.
Do you think that that's what it really is, or do you think that she has possibly more popularity in that area?
I think she would have a tougher time winning in Calgary Elbow. There's no doubt about it. And that's what it's going to come down to in the election. The rural areas will support the UCP. Edmonton will be a solid NDP, and Calgary's the battleground. So can you imagine if she ran in Calgary Elbow and lost?
Could you imagine? Yeah.
I think obviously Brooks Medicine Hat is probably a safe seat, and she made the right call. But it does look, it is a little bit hypocritical not to call it at the same time, I think. But but it just gives the NDP ammunition to say she's afraid to do so.
What about Smith uniting the party and bringing back Todd Loewen and Drew Barnes? Is this a good or a bad decision?
Well, I think it's good. From what our sources said, the vote to expel Todd was very close. Danielle mentioned Todd in her victory speech. Said, we'll see you Monday at the caucus meeting, and we talked to Todd yesterday, and he confirmed that he's officially back in. Drew Barnes is another issue. He has not been mentioned at all by Danielle Smith. and he sort of hasn't issued a statement yet. So Drew Barnes is going to be a lot more interesting to see what happens to him. And yeah, another story for us to keep an eye on.
In your opinion, what value would Kenny bring to the table as an MLA?
Nothing, absolutely nothing. He's already poking at his successor. So still hasn't resigned as an MLA, but I honestly can't see him going back into the ledge. There's rumors, that he's going to, get on the board of directors of various companies. So we'll see how that goes. But I, for one, will be shocked if he is seen in the legislature again.
After the break, our legislative reporter weighs in on the possible changes to both the United Conservative Party and Alberta Health Services. Stay with us. Welcome back. Substance is probably what some Albertans are looking for from their political leaders. But what are the political leaders looking for and thinking about? To hear more about this, Hal Roberts and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post sit down for a chat about just that. Have a look.
Premier Smith says her cabinet, which will be sworn in a couple of weeks, will be rural in makeup and thinking. Now, the vast majority of Albertans I know live in some of the big cities. Are the party's priorities maybe shifting somewhat?
Well, it's tough to say. I mean, I think probably yes. There's a bit of a discrepancy or disparity between the membership of the United Conservative Party and the province as a whole. And what I mean by that is that membership in the party is pretty heavily skewed towards rural and small town Alberta, whereas I think something like 80% of Albertans live in sort of large municipalities, and the vast majority of that in Edmonton and Calgary. So there was sort of this quip about the United Conservatives under Jason Kenney that the cabinet was basically full of people from Calgary. Of course, the UCP only has one MLA in Edmonton, for example, and that's Casey Madhu, the former Justice Minister, now Labour Minister, if I'm not mistaken. So there does seem to be this shift towards rural Alberta, which sort of makes sense considering the party's base, considering the support that Danielle Smith has. The risk for her, politically speaking, is that the bulk of the province's voters are not in these areas. And so what sort of support does that translate into in the next general election?
Yeah, you think they would focus a lot of their attention on Edmonton. As you said, only one MLA in our provincial capital, so why not put a lot of your focus there right now?
Sure, or even in some of the suburban and urban ridings in Calgary that are going to be these battleground ridings. I think if you sort of look at the math and assume the UCP is going to sweep small town and rural Alberta, if the UCP plays it safe and assumes the New Democrats are going to sweep Edmonton, then they really need to put their focus on some of these ridings in Calgary that are going to be tough for them to win, and a couple of ridings in Lethbridge. And it does seem like that's where the attention ought to go. But, early days, new teams are coming in, new staff coming in, new priorities. So a lot of this stuff, I think, reporters tend to show up and ask about X, Y, Z and assume that there's going to be an answer available, right there and then. But I do think we'll see some of this stuff sort of shake out in the weeks and months ahead.
Premier Smith said that Dr. Dina Hinshaw is out as our province's Chief Medical Officer of Health, and she's also vowing to restructure AHS. Tyler, what will that really look like?
Well, firing Dina Hinshaw is sort of more straightforward of the two, I think we can say. Finding a replacement might be a little trickier, but that part of it, I think, is relatively straightforward. But, she said that she's going to restructure AHS by the end of the year, which is not that far away. And so, what is there to say? I think it's sort of anyone's guess how that's going to be accomplished on such a short time frame and what that's going to look like. Because, of course, the province has reorganized AHS a couple times before, going from centralized boards to decentralized to re-centralized and things like that. So we don't actually know a whole ton about what that might look like beyond some of the promises that she made in the leadership race, to clear out the board of AHS and the board of Alberta Health, for example. So those are some of the concrete things we might see. But, in terms of what that might actually look like, I just don't think we know yet, and it's very hard to imagine how that's going to happen on such a short time frame. So I think that's going to be something that reporters are watching very, very carefully, and that the New Democrats are going to be watching very, very carefully, because they would love to have a fight about healthcare. Their polling internally always shows that that's a sort of a bread and butter issue for Albertans. So that is a fight that they are certainly more than willing to take to Danielle Smith should that happen.
We're also watching quite closely the potential of decentralizing EMS dispatch so that municipalities will be given the power once again to bring in ambulances and not have to worry about the centralized, where a lot of mayors, including our mayor here in Lethbridge, is quite concerned about the time it's taking and the length of these ambulances to get to certain situations. What are you hearing right now in Edmonton?
Well, that's one of the strange things too, is that this leadership race was so heavily dominated by talking about COVID and talking about the Sovereignty Act that we didn't get a lot of answers about some of these things. A really similar example is the Alberta Provincial Police thing, which Danielle Smith has said she supports, but does not seem to support eliminating the RCMP entirely. And I was actually just clicking back through my emails before we had this chat, and there hasn't been any sort of policy emails or anything from the Alberta government news offices yet. So we're in sort of this void, I guess, where we actually just simply don't know what's happening on some of these fronts.
After the break, a conversation with an award-winning farmer who was a former vegetarian and oil field engineer who left it all behind to graze and raise cattle in Southern Alberta. Stay with us. Welcome back. Well, we've been hearing a lot about trading in beef for bugs on our dinner plates, but we wanted to bring you the truth about cows grazing the grasslands and forests of Alberta. And so Hal Roberts sat down with a former engineer turned rancher, Ben Campbell of Black Diamond, Alberta. Have a look.
So Ben, what made you decide to go into agriculture to begin with?
I actually had an engineering degree and a job as an engineer working in the oil sands, but it wasn't really my passion. I wanted to do something that I thought was good for the environment, something that gave back to my community, and something that was a better fit for me personally, like working outside and being my own boss. And a friend of mine told me about grazing cattle as a way to meet kind of all those things, that they could be good for the environment. I was actually a vegetarian in university, and I didn't think that cattle were good for the environment. And I tried to limit my meat as much as I could.
So how do you feel about some government officials saying that cattle are not good for the environment because of all of the methane that comes out of them? What are your thoughts in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, like blanket statements. The only blanket statement that's true is that blanket statements are not true, which is, their cattle can be great for the environment if they're managed properly, and cattle can be bad for the environment if they're managed poorly. Methane that comes out of them is part of the natural carbon cycle. Methane is a carbon molecule. And so before there were cattle, there were bison, there's elk and deer and all these different ruminants. And ruminants are a necessary keystone species on grasslands. So methane that's cycled is also absorbed. It has like roughly a 10-year lifespan in the atmosphere. And so we have sort of a biological allowance for that. So I'm fine with that. It fits in with the natural cycle.
Now, in the past, you've said that cattle serve the needs of the grass and soil and not the other way around. Can you really explain how grazing cattle is a benefit to the grass and soil?
Yeah, so ecosystems function as a system, and they need to have all of their parts or else they don't work. So it's the same way as, a car won't work without a transmission or without an engine or without a fuel tank. Ecosystems need all of their parts in order to function properly. And when the glaciers came by, they scraped off all the topsoil in this area of North America. And bison and herds of large ruminants rebuilt that topsoil. So the grasses evolved specifically with grazers, and they have a symbiotic relationship where the cattle need the grass and the grass needs the cattle. There's different types of grasses and with different types of growing competitive strategies. And the act of grazing changes the structure of the canopy of grass and allows different species to flourish. So you actually get a lot of biodiversity as well.
I read years ago that pasture land can actually withstand forest fires. Is that true?
Yeah, grasses, most of their roots are underground. Most of their system is underground, and so they're able to withstand flooding and drought and fires quite well, and they can bounce back really well. So the big thing that we try to do is have healthy grass and healthy soil, so that when you get a big deluge of rain, you're able to absorb that rain and have very little runoff. And when you get if you had a fire, you would have big energy reserves underground, so the grass can bounce back and grow really quickly.
Now, Ben, many cattle ranchers say that cattle are nutrient recyclers. Would you agree with that? And if so, why?
Yeah, so cattle, they do a great thing. They eat foods that humans can't eat. So specifically grasses. If you have a pasture or a hill or a forest, you can put cattle in there. They'll eat those grasses that are completely inedible to humans and form human edible calories. So without destroying or damaging, but in fact benefiting that environment, cattle are able to produce food while making that environment better. And also we have crops that are grown like wheat and barley. And those ones, if they're used for human consumption, that's great. And sometimes you'll get situations, frost or hail, or it's too wet to harvest. There's different things that can decrease the quality of those foods down to what we're called feed quality, where they're not human edible consumption. And so those can be used with cattle rather than let them go to waste. You can feed them to cattle, and they'll recycle those nutrients and convert them again back into human edible calories.
Now, can you share with our viewers how grazing protects land areas against invasive species of plants?
Yeah, so different plants have different competitive strategies. So for example, some grow really well in hot weather, some grow really well in cold, some grow really well in dry, and some grow really well in wet. And what cattle do when they graze is they'll level off. So if there's, for example, early growing plants, if you just didn't put cattle in there, the early growing, tall growing plants would take over the field, and you would end up with them out competing everything else, and you'd have a monoculture, which meaning just one species of plants growing in that field. And when you get cattle in, they'll graze off the early ones, the early growing plants, which is fine. And then you get some later growing plants, and then cattle will graze those later growing plants off. And then next year you've got the early growing plants coming back in. So you're having a cycle of different types of things growing together.
When we return from the break, we take a look at some of the local stories that made headlines this week. Welcome back. If you were anywhere near Mayor McGrath Drive in Lethbridge Saturday afternoon, you may have noticed a convoy of motorcycles. Bikers were encouraged to meet up at the parking lot of the Old Montana's restaurant for a memorial service and final send-off ride for 25-year-old Jake Legg, who tragically lost his life earlier this month in a collision. Legg was riding his motorcycle on October 4th and was heading southbound on Mayor McGrath Drive when he was struck in an intersection by a vehicle turning west onto Scenic Drive. Legg was taken to hospital where he later died. A memorial service was held at 12:30 Saturday, followed by the ride for Jake. Legg's friend Chris Yoakum says Legg was a one-of-a-kind person who will be dearly missed.
You know, Jake was a son, a brother, a fiance, and Jake was also an uncle to 4 nephews and 4 nieces who they like to call Unky Jake. He liked to take him out on the acreage riding, and that was a fun bonding experience for them, of course. Jake actually was a tenant of my wife and I, and he was a great tenant with us and turned out to be a friend as well, until he moved on to his own house with him and his fiance. So yeah, Jake, that's how we met with Jake.
Representatives with 3 First Nation groups say complaints have been filed against Indigenous Services Canada. The claim is adult members of the Piikani, Siksika, and Kainai who live with developmental disabilities were discriminated against. The complaint references continued discrimination caused by ISC on the basis of race, ethnic origin, and disability. The claim also concludes that the federal government has failed to fund and support the services necessary to enable full participation in society for First Nations adults with disabilities. In addition to compensation for each person, the claim will also be seeking funding for cultural programs. A new play in our city is weaving traditional Ukrainian folk music to tell the story of a woman who was taking care of her aging grandmother. It's the brainchild of a playwright who says she's been developing this show since 2017 after discovering her grandmother's journal that she wrote during World War II.
And I discovered this while the revolution of dignity was happening in Ukraine in 2014. And the sentiments that my Baba was sharing in her journal that she had written over 70 years ago were the same sentiments that people were sharing during the revolution in Ukraine today. And so I began writing a story that was reflecting on my Ukrainian-Canadian identity and my relationship with my Ukrainian grandmother. And to further develop this story, then I traveled to Ukraine in 2017, which was 3 years then after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014. Traveled all over the country to my ancestral homelands, my grandparents, and also within 5 kilometers of what was then the front line in eastern Ukraine to do interviews.
The play will take place from October 13th till the 22nd at the Sterndale Bennett Theatre in Lethbridge. The city's newest off-leash dog park has officially opened on the north side. Dog owners and their furry friends can enjoy the Park and Bark, which is located on the corner of Stafford Drive and Scenic Drive North. Mayor Blaine Higgins says having a variety of dog parks in the city is important as they're used quite often.
It's something that we heard so much, as councillors, and especially during the campaign is, can we get more dog parks? Can we get more dog parks? And it's amazing how well they're used. And you'll notice, I know we attend one that's on the south side quite often, and even finding parking sometimes is a struggle because they're so well used, and that's so exciting to have this many dog parks within our community for sure.
General Manager of Parks and Cemeteries for the City of Lethbridge, Blair Ricker, says the name of the area, Park and Bark, was selected by the community. The area is over 22,000 square meters in size and includes a dedicated space for small breeds of dogs. It is Fire Prevention Week. This year also marks the 100-year anniversary of when adults and children alike learned how to stay safe in case of a fire. This year's theme is Fire Won't Wait, Plan Your Escape. Lethbridge Fire Prevention Officer Adam Satterley says developing a fire escape plan is more important than ever because the time is of the essence.
We try to emphasize that you have 2 ways to get out, and it's for safety, mostly because of the fact that homes nowadays, with what you put inside your house, they're very combustible. We've got a lot of petrochemicals in furnitures and things like that. So when we used to have fires, back in the 70s and 80s, we would have 8, 9, 10 minutes to get out before you were overcome by smoke. Now it's cut down to about 3 or 4. And I guess, again, it's because of what we're putting into our homes.
After the break, what's the economic outlook for Southern Alberta during these pre-recession times? Well, we tell you next. Stay with us.